Okay, and someone has asked if I can record, and I believe I am now recording. So we will see how that goes. All right, so before we begin, there's a few things I just want to lay out. First, this is a difficult topic, right? We're talking about violence, murder, and exploitation of entire communities. This is something that's been a part of American culture for a very long time, but it can be a very difficult topic to discuss. I've purposefully chosen not to include a lot of images of police violence. I know with the recent protests, there's been a whole ton of images of police brutality and police violence, and I think there's an interesting conversation to be had about how much we need to see images of violence like that in order to really understand the extent of the problem. But I also know that everyone has different limits in terms of the amount of that kind of imagery they're comfortable seeing. And so for this talk, I've decided to not show a lot of these images. First, second, this is a big and complicated issue. I have tried as best I can to cover as many elements of it as we can within an hour, but this is something where each individual section we're talking on could be a whole course in and of itself. The racial elements of criminal justice, racial bias extends throughout criminal justice and really permeates every aspect of it. And so it's really hard once you start looking at it to really decide where to end. But I've decided to include as much of it as I can here, but certainly I would be more than happy to hold just more discussions in the future to really drill down into more particular areas if there are interests. And then finally, this is only a single facet of a much larger issue of systemic racism within our country and within our communities. And so there's obviously many more areas of racism that we could discuss. But today we're going to focus on this in particular. This is not to say that there aren't a lot of other issues that we need to address in order to really handle the issue of systemic racism in general. All right, and then just a quick note on data. Transparency in law enforcement is bad. There's no universal rules about data collection and reporting. Many places don't really collect data at all. And some places that do collect data, it requires lawsuits or other actions to actually have that data brought out into the public. I've attempted to use the best data I can find. There are some areas where I've had to use more regional data. And when I've done so, I've done it in a way that I think that regional data reflects broader, more national trends. And then I've tried to use national data wherever it's available. But if I've not used, if there's an area where I don't have data, it may be because that data just doesn't exist. All right, so in terms of, I'm gonna start by talking about some of the issues in criminal justice, and then I'm gonna talk about some targets for reform. Obviously, a lot of these areas are highly intertwined. Racism, for example, obviously permeates police violence, policing for profit, and accountability. But I'm going to talk about each of these in turn, and then I'm going to talk about targets for reform. In terms of reform targets, there's a lot of different areas that people have been working on, a lot of different facets to police reform. I'm going to start by talking about qualified immunity. There's also a lot of issues with police unions, community relations, training, procedures, and oversight and accountability. And I think one thing that's common to all of these areas for reform is that people really want a police force within their community that functions for the good of the community, right? Those of us who are lucky to live in wealthier suburbs have a relationship with criminal justice that's very different from a lot of folks who live in inner cities. And I think ideally, we would have a police force that is engaged with the community, responds to the needs of the community, and is integrated into that community. And so to start, obviously, with the killing of George Floyd, there's been a lot of focus recently on police violence and police militarization. And I think any discussion of criminal justice reform needs to start here. And so, given the importance of this in raising awareness of the problems with police, I would just like to start off by showing a list of African Americans who have been killed by police within the last 10 years, okay? Right, so many of these cases have made the news, but many more have not. This is something that's been going on for as long as modern policing has existed, and is a much larger issue than I think many of us realized before some of these high-profile killings came into the public view. Since 2005, there's been over 13,000 people killed by police. According to police reports, most of those suspects were armed. However, I'm going to talk in a moment about the issues with police reports. Of those 13,000 people killed, 35 of those incidents led to officers being convicted of crimes related to the killings, and 3 officers have been convicted of murder. And that, I think, speaks a little bit to accountability and to the way in which police are very rarely held accountable for killings. If you're talking about 13,000 incidents with the police, and this data would have you believe that in only 35 cases was there anything wrong, and in only 3 of those did the level of police misconduct raise to murder. As an example of this, what I'm showing here is the official police report for the incident where George Floyd was killed. And so I'll just read it briefly for those of you who may not be able to see. On Monday evening, shortly after 8 p.m., officers from the Minneapolis Police Department responded to the 3700 block of Chicago Avenue South on a report of a forgery in progress. Officers were advised that the suspect was sitting on the top of a blue car and appeared to be under the influence. 2 officers arrived and located the suspect, a male believed to be in his 40s, in his car. He was ordered to step out of his car. After he got out, he physically resisted officers. Officers were able to get the suspect into handcuffs and noted he appeared to be suffering medical distress. Officers called for an ambulance. He was transported to Hennepin County Medical Center by ambulance, where he died a short time later. At no time were weapons of any type used by anyone involved in the incident. And so this really shows how police reports are not a accurate tool when we're talking about the how police interact with the community and how how these events play out, right? So in this police reports, officers were able to get the suspect into handcuffs and noted he appeared to be suffering medical distress. That sentence would appear to be the sentence that covers that 9 minutes plus that the officers were kneeling on George Floyd's neck, which resulted in his death, right? That is a, obviously, when you look at the videos, there's a big difference there. And I think it's important to realize is that the only reason we know that this police report isn't accurate is because there is video of the incident. And in many, many, many more interactions of officers and police, there is not an independent video record. And so we are forced to rely on police reports like this for the statistics. And so knowing this, we should treat any study on police violence that relies on these reports with a heavy grain of salt. Of course, police violence encompasses far more than killing. If what we have seen over time is, if you've watched any of the videos of the protests after George Floyd or after Ferguson or even earlier, what you see is a police department that really looks like a military organization. We see military vehicles, we see police in body armors, body armors with weapons and grenade launchers and that sort of thing. And this militarization of police is a process that has been happening really for the last 20 or 30 years. And as an example that did not involve someone dying, this example from Colorado, June 3rd, 2015, there was a suspected shoplifter fleeing police who broke into a gentleman by the name of John Leach's house and locked himself in. The homeowner had never met the shoplifter and was completely uninvolved with the crime. So faced with a shoplifter, and again, to be clear, this is a shoplifter, not a murderer, not someone who is suspected to be involved in a violent crime. When faced with this person locked inside the house, over the course of June 3rd and 4th, police deployed flashbang grenades, tear gas, 40mm rounds, 2 Bearcat armored assault vehicles, and breaching rams against Mr. Leach's house, completely destroying it. His home was valued at about $580,000, and in the end, it was an utter ruin and had to be torn down. An investigation into the police procedures found there were no violations of procedures, and the city compensated Mr. Leach $5,000 for his damages. This case eventually went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that this was not a violation of his rights and that the $5,000 was all he was entitled to. And I think this, again, really gets to what we think police should be and what we think and what police actually are, where we are in terms of our protections. Over the last really 30 or 40 years, the 4th and 5th Amendments, which are supposed to protect citizens from government intrusion into their property and onto their rights, has been systematically weakened by a number of court cases. And now we're at this point here where the 4th Amendment, which is supposed to protect against the government's search and seizure, the government's taking your property and destroying your property, has gotten to the point where a completely innocent bystander can have their home destroyed with basically no compensation at all, and that can be considered not unusual and not to violate police procedures. The military equipment that we see the police using against the protesters generally is given to police departments through something called U.S. Department of Defense 1033 program. This program allows the transfer of used military equipment to police departments. And there's really very little in the way of restraint or oversight in determining what police departments get this equipment, and really even determining if they have any legitimate need for it. Police departments can simply request this equipment and generally it'll be granted. For example, the Los Angeles School Police Department, which is the department within the Los Angeles Police that is responsible for policing elementary and high schools, public schools, has been given M16 rifles, mine-resistant assault vehicles, and grenade launchers through this program to help police Los Angeles public schools. Studies that have looked at the use of the program 1033 have found that it's linked to increased officer shootings. So the more military equipment a department receives through the 1033 program, the more likely officers are to be involved in police shootings. And the reason for that really, I think, is that military equipment leads to military tactics. SWAT teams, the police special weapons and tactics teams, when originally conceived, were supposed to be used only for the most extremely violent circumstances. So things like armed hostage takers, things like active violent threats to the community. That's what a SWAT team was supposed to deal with. Now we have SWAT teams. One is the number of SWAT teams in the country has gone up dramatically. And when you have a SWAT team, you're paying these officers to be a part of it. People find a way to use the SWAT teams. And so, for example, now SWAT teams are routinely used just to serve search warrants and for other activities that you would really not think that you would need this kind of activity for. And so there's a question here. Yeah, the 1033 programs are still active, and this is still going on at the moment. There's really still very, very little oversight into these programs. As an example of the use of SWAT teams, and this is something that we need to think about ourselves, is in Arizona in 2019, this is just last year, parents brought their child to a primary care physician's office. The parents did not believe in vaccinations. They were very much the naturopathic, believed in naturopathic medicine, and their child had an extremely high fever. The physician, the primary care physician, thought the child needed to go into the hospital. The parents disagreed and they left with their child against medical advice. The physician was concerned about the safety of the child, and so decided to call the Department of Child Services. The DCS officer called the police, and the police, to respond to this family who had taken their child out of the doctor's office against medical advice, called in the SWAT team. And so you had the circumstance here where the SWAT team ended up using a battering ram to break down this family's door and storm into their house with guns drawn, looking for a febrile 2-year-old. And obviously this is something that the physician didn't want to happen, but it shows the risks of involving the police in an area where they really probably shouldn't be involved to begin with. This is something that we've been talking about recently in the social justice group in the medicine department. We routinely send police to people's houses for wellness checks if we're not able to get in touch with people and they may have a life-threatening medical problem. At the moment, what we do is we send the police to their house to see if they're all right. And given some of the statistics about outcomes of police officers, particularly involved in responding to mental health crises, this might be something that I think we should look at in the future, and maybe we need to develop some other capacity, because at the moment we don't have the capacity to use other resources for this, but it's something we might want to consider developing in the future. Racism is obviously a major element of what we've been seeing in terms of police violence against communities. I had a hard time trying to figure out how to talk about racism in the context of police reform, really because racism permeates every single aspect of the criminal justice system. So I have a list here of areas of criminal justice, and in each one of these areas, there have been multiple studies that have found significant racial bias in every element of these systems. To fully explore the impact of racism on criminal justice, you would really have to go into each one of these areas and dissect it completely. And there's really hundreds and hundreds of studies on these, and I would encourage you, if you have an interest in any one of these, to look further into it. This is one of those areas where what I find is you have a sense before you start looking into the data that things are bad, but when you actually start really looking into the data, you realize just how much worse it actually is. And so just as an example, I've highlighted two particular areas here. One is, I know many of you have seen this statistic before, 1 in 9 Black men between the ages of 20 and 34 are currently in prison. That's not have ever been in prison, that is, are currently in prison. And when you think about the ages of 20 to 34, when you think about what you do during that period of time, this is the time where you start a family, you start a career, you really start your adult life. And 1 in 9 Black men have to go through that period spending their time with a prison record or being in prison throughout that period of time. African Americans comprise 13% of the population. They're also 13% of drug users. Studies have repeatedly shown that the rates of substance abuse do not vary across ethnic groups. However, they comprise 55% of those convicted of drug offenses. The war on drugs has been absolutely devastating for minority communities in terms of the consequences of mass incarceration. Many of you heard me talk before about the consequences of what happened when one in 9 Black men get released from prison with drug offenses on their records, and the way in which those drug offenses affect their ability to function in society going forward. Another study which I found more recently, which again, even knowing a lot about this, I still found surprising, was this 2007 Harvard study that found that even within the African American community, there is discrepancies in prison sentencing depending on the color of someone's skin. And so in this study, they looked at 67,000 felons in Georgia, and they divided these African Americans into light skin, medium skin, and dark skin. And what they found was that on average, the sentence for white men was 2,600 days. The sentence for black men on average was 378 days longer, so about a year longer. However, for lighter skinned African Americans, it was 105 days. And then for the darker skinned African Americans, 550 days. So again, even within the African American community, people face varying degrees of discrimination depending on the actual tone of their skin. So policing for profit, just to define the term a little bit, this is the way, policing for profit is a term used to describe the ways in which police departments extract money from the communities that they serve. This is done through a variety of means, from the seizure of property to ticketing and fines, to the use of court fees and escalating fee systems to extract money from the communities that they serve. These police departments often are responsible for larger areas, and what we see in this policing for profit system is that police focus on areas that have less political voice. And so, if you're looking at a county that has mixed, more affluent and less affluent areas, in general, it's the less affluent areas that are targeted for these kinds of policies, precisely because they don't have a political voice to stand up for it. And the police know that if they tried to do this in wealthier areas, there would be more of a political backlash. And so it is a way of preying on voiceless communities. One element of this which has gotten attention over the last few years is something called civil asset forfeiture. So this is a procedure that started during the war on drugs in the 80s. And the idea behind civil asset forfeiture is that we didn't want drug kingpins to go to jail for a couple of years, but then to be released from jail and still have access to all of the money that they got through their criminal activities. And so civil asset forfeiture is a policy that allows police to seize property that they suspect of being involved in crime or having ties to crime. However, the way civil asset forfeiture has been written, property can be seized without any criminal charges actually being filed against the owners of the property. And being innocent of a crime doesn't actually mean that the state has to return your property. So the state can seize your property without ever actually charging you with a crime if they say that they believe your property is involved with a crime. An example, so this has expanded dramatically over time. So in 1985, there was $27 million seized. In 2008, that number increased to $3.1 billion. And more recently, the amount of money seized by law enforcement from individuals actually exceeded the total amount of money that individuals had stolen over that time. And so police civil asset forfeiture losses actually exceeded total criminal losses in that year. And less than 20% of federal seizures involved property whose owners were ever actually prosecuted. And so if you think about that, so 80% of the money that they took from someone who they never actually then accused of a crime. So I'm just going to go back here for a moment. An example of this, Leon and Mary Adams in Philadelphia. So this is a Philadelphia couple. They've been living in their home for over 5 decades. One morning they were eating breakfast when police came to their door. They entered the house and said the couple had 10 minutes to leave permanently. The police department had decided that they would be seizing their house. The reason that they cited is that Leanna Marie Adams' grandson had sold $20 of marijuana on their porch. And so the police decided that their house was an asset that had been used in the committing of a crime. And so they seized their house and sold it as auction. And the money from that house then was used to fund the police department. This did generate a lot of attention. There were some really high profile civil asset forfeiture cases. And many states did reform their civil asset forfeiture laws. However, there were some loopholes that we'll talk about a little bit later that allow local police departments to get around this. Civil asset forfeiture gets a lot of attention, but there's a lot of smaller things that police do to generate revenue from their communities that happens every day in minority communities. Ferguson, obviously Ferguson, Missouri was the police department that was involved in the killing of Michael Brown. After the killing of Michael Brown, the Department of Justice did a significant review of the Ferguson policing practices. And what they found was that there was a extensive and very conscious focus on generating revenue from the African-American communities in Ferguson. The fines and fees that the police department extracted from the community was a significant portion of the city budget, and the city would explicitly go to the police department and ask them to increase this revenue to try and make up for budget shortfalls in tax revenues and other things. The city also closely monitored whether those financial goals were met. The revenue generation was stressed heavily within the police department, and the message was straight from the city leadership, right down from the police chief on down to the individual's office. The Department of Justice found that the city's emphasis on revenue generation really shaped every aspect of how the police department interacted with the community. Officers were promoted based not on their interactions with the community, not on crimes, but on the number of citations and on the amount of money they were able to bring in to the police department. And during this, there was absolutely no consideration of whether the enforcement strategies used actually promoted public safety in any way or unnecessarily undermined trust and cooperation within the community. And I think it's important to realize this when you saw the reaction of the community of Ferguson to the killing. You have to understand that it took place in the setting of year after year of this kind of petty enforcement. One example that was cited in the Department of Justice report was a man who was an African-American man who, after working out, went to his car, was sitting in his car eating a snack. His car was parked legally on the street. The police came up to him and they gave him a ticket for operating a motor vehicle without a seatbelt because he didn't have his seatbelt on as he was eating a snack in his car. This ticket, he couldn't pay the ticket, and so he was eventually issued a summons and eventually lost his license, and then was forced to either to decide whether or not to continue to drive to work on an expired license and risk the follow-up fines if he was caught, or basically to leave his job. And so these little, and there are many, many, many examples of how these tiny little tickets and fines can really snowball on people who don't have a lot of resources available. And when you consider that the police were specifically targeting the communities that had the fewest resources, you can see how this had a very significant impact on the health of the community as a whole. And so accountability, when we talk about police misconduct, we generally think about it in terms of how can we hold officers accountable for the things that they do. And in general, there are three ways in which we can hold the police accountable for misconduct, hold an individual police officer accountable for misconduct. First, and in cases like George Floyd, there's criminal charges, right? If the police murder someone without justification, they can be arrested and they can be charged criminally. Second, separate from criminal charges, the victims or their families can bring civil rights lawsuits against the police officers or the police departments for having their rights violated. And then third, even in the absence of lawsuits, internal investigations within a police department can discipline or fire officers who are behaving inappropriately. Unfortunately, all of these things are extremely difficult to actually put into practice. Right? So in criminal accountability, as we have seen in case after case of police violence, it is extremely difficult to hold police criminally accountable for their actions. And this goes back to Rodney King years ago, all the way up into current cases. We've just now started seeing some police actually be held accountable and charged for some of these crimes. One element of this is something called the Police Bill of Rights. Many states have adopted these bills of rights, and they provide officers with an extra layer of legal protection that civilians don't have. So for example, if I was suspected of killing someone, I would be immediately brought into a police department and questioned about my involvement. Police officers are allowed cooling off periods. So after an incident where they are involved in a shooting, their Bill of Rights says that they cannot be questioned right after this when their memory is fresh. They're given time to cool off before they are forced to make a statement. They are also given the opportunity to review tapes and evidence that exist before they make their official on-the-record statement. And obviously this allows officers to speak to each other and to get all of their stories straight, and to review any video evidence before they decide what their actual final story is going to be. Even when charges are considered, prosecutors are generally very reluctant to bring charges against police officers. The prosecutors generally work very closely with the police. They consider themselves allied with the police, and often decide to hold off charges until political pressure becomes strong enough. Even then, you see many officers use grand jury, basically can manipulate or can influence the grand juries into not bringing procedures. There's an old statement in law that a grand jury would indict a ham sandwich if the prosecutor asks them to. And just to explain a little bit about grand juries, so the role of a grand jury is not to decide guilt or innocence of a crime. It is to decide whether or not there is sufficient evidence to actually bring charges against someone. So not whether that person is innocent, but whether there is evidence that exists that this person may have committed a crime to the extent that it is worth charging them. And so when you see prosecutors have at times affected the evidence that they give to grand juries in such a way that the grand juries then return a no bill, or which is basically to say that there has not been a crime committed, and that the prosecutors can then use that as a shield to sort of protect themselves from political accountability. And finally, even when charged, juries tend to be very deferential to police officers. There's generally an assumption that police officers are telling the truth, even though when you actually start to look at the evidence, that assumption is really not based on any actual evidence. But in general, juries tend to take the side of the police, which can make securing a conviction very, very difficult. So separate from criminal accountability, there's civil lawsuits, right? So these are suing victims or victims' families, suing the police departments for damages. There are a number of legal shields that protects officers from civil accountability. The biggest one is qualified immunity, which I'll talk about in a moment, and it's extremely difficult to overcome these barriers. And even when you can overcome the barriers and extract judgments, the judgments don't actually affect the officers of the police departments. A new study that just came out showed that 99.98% of damages recovered in civil rights lawsuits were paid by the local governments rather than by individual police officers or by police departments. So qualified immunity is worth discussing a little bit separately because it's become a target for police reform and really is often the legal standard that is responsible for many of the most egregious injustices in terms of holding police accountable. And basically the idea of qualified immunity is that it is a doctrine that states that if a officer of the government is performing the duties of their job, they are absolutely immune from lawsuits unless it can be shown that they have violated clearly established constitutional rights and that they knew that this was a violation of clearly established constitutional rights while they were violating them. And what this has created is this system where because police have never really been held accountable for these things, there are no clearly established precedents holding them accountable. And so because there are no clearly established precedents holding them accountable, you cannot hold other officers accountable for doing the same thing. And so this is just a brief list of things that courts have decided were where officers had qualified immunity. So stealing $225,000. This case of shooting a 10-year-old, this is a case where an officer was chasing a robbery suspect. He believed that the robbery suspect had fled through this family's yard, even though the robbery suspect had not. But he entered this family's yard where a 10-year-old was playing with his dog. The dog didn't threaten the officer, but the officer decided to kill the dog. And while trying to kill the dog, the officer shot the 10-year-old. And the courts decided that the officer was absolutely immune from any civil lawsuit relating to this action because it had not been clearly established that this was a violation of this 10-year-old's rights. If you look at more of these, it's an infuriating list of horrible abuses that people have been held completely immune for. And so finally, when we talk about criminal justice or civil justice, the final element of holding police accountable is internal discipline. So this is if officers can be disciplined or fired or demoted. This is also something that's extremely difficult to do, in large part because of police unions. Police unions, there have been a number of studies on the effects of police unions on police departments and communities, and every single published study has expressed the opinion that police unions have a negative effect on innovation, on accountability, and on police-community relations. Unionized police departments kill more people and have more use of force complaints than non-unionized police departments. It increases the cost of firing bad officers, and it shields officers from accountability. Even when departments go through the procedure of firing people, in 50 to 70% of the cases, the officers fired for misconduct are rehired, often being granted back pay. And even officers who are not rehired by that department can often find work at neighboring police departments. So those are some areas of concern within policing right now. I want to talk about police reform. I think a good place to start is obviously in the wake of George Floyd, there have been both House and Senate national police reform bills. And I think it's useful to look at both of them as a starting point for where the two national political parties are in terms of thinking about police reform. So the Senate bill, which is the Republican bill, has addressed a number of elements here. But I think for anyone who looks at this, I feel it really doesn't go very far in actually making any changes. It doesn't ban chokeholds, it just incentivizes cities to ban chokeholds. The only thing it really actually creates is a police misconduct registry. However, it makes that registry accessible only to other police departments. It asks states to only collect data on things like no-knock raids and state review boards. And it explicitly rejects the idea of ending qualified immunity. The House side does go a little bit further. It bans no-knock raids, but it says that you must change no-knock raids to knock-and-announce raids. That's not actually a particularly major change. What it just really means in practice, when you look at these actual raids, is that instead of just ramming down someone's door, the police have to shout "police" as the ram is swinging for the door. And recently, Breonna Taylor was actually killed in a knock-and-announce raid rather than a no-knock raid. When you think about the perspective of the homeowner, you probably, given the chaos of the situation of having dozens of armed men knock down your door and run into your house screaming, the fact that they may or may not have shouted "police" first, you may not be able to process that adequately within the time you have in order to respond. The House bill does make the misconduct registry, and it does make that registry public. That's a really good positive element of that. It does provide some money for review boards, but I don't think it really goes far enough. I think the biggest element of the House bill is that it ends qualified immunity. And I think when you think about police reform, qualified immunity is really, ending qualified immunity is really a necessary element to any kind of meaningful police reform, because if you keep qualified immunity, you really have no legal mechanism for holding police officers or police departments accountable for a lot of these abuses. And finally, the House bill does ban chokeholds, although again, with things like qualified immunity, banning chokeholds on their own isn't really gonna make a meaningful difference if you can't actually hold the police officer accountable for using the banned chokeholds. So a way in which these bills could go further would be to completely ban these forced entry raids unless there is an imminent threat. We talked about this a little bit in the SWAT teams. Unless there's an active shooter or a hostage situation or something like that, there's really very few circumstances where police need to kick open the door and run into a house in the way that they often do now when they're even doing things like serving search warrants. This idea that delaying a few seconds will allow criminals to hide all of the evidence is really more of a drug war myth than anything that there's actually evidence for. And the evidence for the human cost of these no-knock raids is very, very real, both in individuals who were accidentally killed, like Breonna Taylor, like many others, and in the risks to police officers, where you have homeowners who have responded with violence to what they perceive as a bunch of random armed people walking into their house. In terms of the review boards, one area where the Democratic bill falls short is that it makes it doesn't say who can be on these review boards. And what has happened in a lot of communities is that police departments will just create a review board that is made up of members of neighboring police departments. So Police Department A will make a review board that's made up entirely of members of Police Department B. Police Department B will do the opposite. And so what we really need is an independent review boards that is both mandatory and is not made up of other law enforcement personnel, is made up of members of the community. Again, we need to end qualified immunity. Other ways which we can hold police accountable are lowering the thresholds for Monell claims. Monell claims are a way in which individuals can actually hold police departments accountable. And what this says is that if a police department, if the culture and the training of a police department makes abuse inevitable, then the police department can actually be held accountable for the violence and the abuse that those police officers go on to commit. And this is a way to actually force change on police departments by holding them accountable for the actions of their officers. Another thing that needs to happen is there is a loophole now. As I mentioned, many states have put restrictions on civil asset forfeiture, but the federal civil asset forfeiture is still going, and many local departments are able to bypass state restrictions by just partnering with the federal agency for their asset forfeiture operations. And so that needs to change. Um, in other things, the provocation rule, this is something that used to exist, again, about 50, 60 years ago, but court cases over time have weakened and essentially eliminated this rule. If we wanted to revive it, it could be actually written into law, which would mean that courts would have to take it into account. The provocation rule holds that officers are accountable if they escalate an encounter that ends in violence, even if the police officer's violence in that extreme moment may be justified. And so what that means in practice is that if a police officer starts shoving someone and starts hitting someone, if that person in self-defense or swings back at the police officer then will be held accountable if they then escalate to lethal force, even if that person did in fact hit that police officer. If the police officer was the one that escalated the encounter, they can be held accountable. Currently, that is not the case. Also, disciplinary records must be made public. This just happened very recently in New York City, and we are now seeing the way some of these bad officers are shielded by the police. Another thing in the misconduct registries, we should also include police officers who lie under oath and who lie in police reports. This is something that we see occasionally when officers are held accountable. You can see that they have had decades of lying that have ended up imprisoning hundreds and hundreds of people. One example of how disciplinary records can bring to light misconduct is with the release of the New York City stats. What they found is that 41% of officers have no complaints against them at all. 21% had a single complaint. And so that's 62% of officers had 0 to 1 public complaint about their conduct. 9%, so a little less than 10% of officers had more than 6 complaints. There's one officer, Jeremiah Williams, of the 47th Precinct in the Bronx, who had 60 police complaints, or 60 use of force complaints, including 11 misconduct lawsuits and 4 accusations of sexually assaulting suspects. During the time that those 60 complaints were leveled against him, he had received 13 raises and was promoted to detective. And so the only reason we know that now is that these records are now public. Otherwise, each individual person leveling a complaint against this officer would have no way of knowing that anyone else had ever made a complaint against this person in the past. So another element of police reform is to think about what is the role of the police, right? What do we want the police to do? In many cases, police departments are filling roles that really they weren't designed to do. And they may be forced to do things that we as a community don't want them actually doing. I think in general, right, when we think about the police, we think about fighting crime, right? That's the idea, is in the public's mind, police officers solve crimes and arrest people for doing crimes. However, when you actually look at the data, they don't do a very good job of this, right? So this is the crime clearance rates in total in US cities in 2018. And what this says is about 40% of people who murder someone end up getting away with it because there's no arrest made. And only 12% of auto theft, 13% of burglaries, etc., are ever actually end in an arrest. And when you look over time, these statistics, these clearance rates are going down. From 90% in the 1960s down now to about 60%. And in many cities, the clearance rates are far worse, right? So Chicago has a 26% murder clearance rate. Boston has a 46% clearance rate. And so the thing that I think people most want police to do, which is to go after violent crimes and violent criminals, they're actually not really able to do that with any success. And when you look at what police officers actually spend their time doing, only 3 to 16% of a police officer's time is devoted to actually fighting crime. As we've seen with police militarization, they're trained like soldiers, they're equipped like soldiers, but we're often asking them to perform the jobs of social workers. We're sending them to do mental health checks, to do animal control. And if we train and equip people like soldiers, they may resort to violence in circumstances where we really, really don't want them to resort to violence. When you look at the time police spend training here, so 111 hours spent on firearms and self-defense compared to 16 hours spent on community policing, mediation, and conflict management. And given this, and this doesn't even include things like the police warrior training and paramilitary training programs that a lot of police departments have their officers participate in. And you can see if you've had barely 1/10 of the time on conflict management that you've had on firearms and self-defense, in a stressful moment, you may fall back on your firearms and self-defense training instead of on de-escalation and management. Finally, I want to end here on the idea of abolishing the police, right? This is something that's had a lot of attention online, and I think this phrase means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And I think in general, the idea being that what we need to do is fundamentally rethink the idea of policing and what the police do, how they're trained, and what they're responsible for. And the problem with thinking about this is that there's really very, very few cases where this has ever been tried. And so I want to finish here by talking about really the one case I think that exists of a community that just completely abolished the police department and started over. That's Camden, New Jersey. So Camden, New Jersey is actually very similar in a lot of ways to Springfield in that it is a former manufacturing center that's fallen on hard times. So this is a city actually very near where I grew up that is rife with crime, 3,000 abandoned buildings, 40% of the residents living below the poverty line. In 2010, Camden had a huge budget crisis and had to lay off half its police force. In response to this, violent and nonviolent crime skyrocketed. Police accountability was also basically non-existent. Of the 37 excessive force complaints in 2011, none of them were actually sustained. And in that time, 5 officers were actually charged with evidence planting and perjury, leading to 88 overturned convictions. And so Camden came up with a plan. The idea was they would, the Camden City Police Department would be dissolved, and in its place they would create the Camden County Police Department. So the control of the police would go from the city to the county, but by doing this, the city was able to dissolve the department and dissolve the police union and get rid of the union contract. This happened in 2013. They laid off the entire police department, and individual officers had to reapply for their jobs. And when they were reapplying, they were able to look at disciplinary records, complaints of police brutality and that sort of thing, and decide which officers to hire back. They were also, because the police union contract was dissolved, able to decrease salaries and benefits and expand the department from 250 to 400, right? And I think many of us are generally pro-labor unions, and there is a conflict here in terms of workers, the rights of workers to bargain for better working conditions, better salaries, versus the very real and documented harm that police unions do. And I think this is a conflict that's playing out right now in the labor movement as they interact with police unions. So what happened here is that they put reforms into place to change how the cops saw their role in the communities. They prioritized citizen complaints and made sure that citizen complaints were resolved quickly. They removed removed arrests and ticketing from performance metrics. And this is a quote by the chief of police. This is one of the things what he said to the officers. He said, "I don't want you to write tickets. I don't want you to lock anybody up. I'm dropping you off on this corner that has a crime rate greater than that of Juarez, Mexico. And for the next 12 hours, I don't want you to make an arrest unless it's for an extremely violent offense. Don't call us. We're not coming back to get you until the end of your shift. So if you got to go to the bathroom, you need to make a friend out there. If you want to get something to eat, you better find out who the good cooks are. And the idea here was to force the police to integrate into the community. They also developed a use of force guidelines that was approved by both the ACLU and the Fraternal Order of Police. I don't think there are really many guidelines that both of those agencies agree on. And what they found was that excessive force complaints dropped from a high of 65 down to 5 per year, and that murders dropped from 67 in 2012 to 22 in 2018. This is still a work in progress, and Camden has stated that its next steps are for a more representative police force, lower turnover, and greater transparency in its policies. But the fact that it has released these at all is really a huge improvement versus many police forces. And so in terms of what we can do about this, the police, this is fundamentally a political issue. And so this is something where if we want to advocate for change, the people to advocate to are our legislators, both locally and nationally. I've got some resources for you here, and I'll send this out to everyone. These are letter templates for advocating for police reform. And the bottom one is a guide from the NAACP on criminal justice reform and race relations. And then finally, just to give you all this information if you don't have it, this is our, the Springfield, our congressperson. This is those of you in Worcester. And then finally, these are our these are links to our state legislatures and for both Springfield and for Worcester. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing here. Thank you all. And are there any questions? Feel free to speak up or just to type something into the chat. No, so the question here is, do other countries have qualified immunity? Qualified immunity is a uniquely American legal doctrine, and I don't think it exists anyplace else.
I had a question, Dr. Churchill.
Yes.
I just wanted to say too, thank you for this talk. I'm not part of PURCH. I'm from the Worcester campus, but Amanda told me about this, and this has been really wonderful. I really appreciate it. The question that I had is, you talked a lot about police reform specifically, but I was wondering what you think the role is for, I guess, broader criminal justice reforms in terms of who we're incarcerating and how we're incarcerating people, because I think a lot of the incentives that the police have come from that system as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this gets into a lot of other topics. So the war on drugs in particular has created this, you know, this really, it comes all the way back to the Drug Reform Act of 1986, which really singled out crack cocaine for special punishment. Crack cocaine was something that was used more in minority communities than in whiter communities, and it created this real mass incarceration in minority communities. And what we are seeing now is the follow-on effects of the sort of devastating effect this has had. And you know, going back to the slide, things like bail, the racial differences between people who are arrested and convicted of exactly the same crime, the rates in which they are offered probation versus mandatory jail sentences. All of these things are huge issues, and there's racial disparities in absolutely every level of it, from top to bottom. So in terms of anything specific to Massachusetts, yes, so just today, and unfortunately I haven't been able to really fully read it yet, there was a report that came out on the Springfield Police Narcotics Division on abuses, abuse of force within that division as well. And we have, we have not banned qualified immunity. Colorado, I think, is the only state so far that has gone, has actually done action, has actually gone to the level of ending qualified immunity. And I think absolutely we should be advocating criminal justice reform to our local and to our federal legislators. So another question here is, what are your thoughts about decriminalizing sex work and the sale and usage of drugs, since these are models in other countries? Yeah, and so these are, yeah, absolutely. And so yes, in general, decriminalization of sex work, absolutely. For drugs, certainly for things like marijuana, I think it's absolutely insane that we have people in jail for marijuana. For other drugs, it's a complicated issue. In general, what we need to do, all of the data out there suggests that treatment and support and community support is far more cost effective at reducing both individual and societal harms than interdiction and incarceration. And I think the war on drugs has been devastating for the United States. We've spent trillions of dollars and we have not budged the rates of addiction in the United States by one bit. The rates are exactly the same now as they were back in the 80s when we started the war on drugs. And we need to completely rethink about how we interact with substance abuse. And that also includes medically thinking about substance abuse, not as a personal or as a moral failing, but as an illness that needs to be treated. And those of you who have taken my other classes certainly know that this is something I talk quite a bit about. Right, so the presence of police force in the hospitals. It's a good question. I see this personally with, in my work in the jail, when we send people into the hospital from the prison, they are accompanied by officers. And when you think about how the medical interview goes, right, we are always taught that medical interviews are confidential. But I'm curious, when people have encountered patients who have had police officers, if they've asked the police officers to step out while they've been interviewing the patients. We have security in the hospital, but in general, we try to manage people who are agitated and people who are violent without resorting to the kind of violence that police often do. And I think in general, when we understand the relationship between the Springfield communities and all minority communities and the police, I think it should really prompt rethinking how we as medical providers use police in our work. Yeah, absolutely. Good, any other questions? All right, well, thank you so much for joining me. I know you guys are sick to death of Zoom lectures like this, and so I really appreciate you coming here, especially in the evening, to sit for one more giant Zoom lecture with me on this topic. I really appreciate it. I think this is something important for us to be discussing more in PURCH in general, and I look forward to seeing you all in person soon. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Churchill. That was amazing.
Thank you.
How will we be able to access this later on?
I am going to send this to Justin, who is currently on vacation, but I'm going to get him to send out the slides. Actually, you know what? I think I emailed you guys all today, so I will send that out, particularly the bits on contacting your state legislators. All right. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Churchill. This was wonderful.
And yes, absolutely. Please share this with folks in Worcester. This is not proprietary in any way. I am happy to have this, have other people take a look at this information.